The morning she gave away her father's revolver, the wind came hot and cruel off the desert, like it knew what was about to begin. Reva Harper hadn't fired Promise in 2 years, not since pulling it from his dead hands, not since swearing vengeance on the man who shot him in the back. But when an old Apache with a limp appeared at her porch and asked if the gun was her father's, everything changed. She handed him the Colt. And 30 days later, he came back, with a killer, a debt repaid, and a question only blood could answer. The morning she gave away the revolver, the wind was hot and mean. It came off the desert like a hiss through cracked teeth, pushing dust in long streaks across the dry porch wood where Reva Harper sat, with her boots propped up, one hand on her coffee mug and the other resting just inches from the gun. The revolver had been her father's, a Colt single-action army, nickel-plated, ivory grip worn smooth by decades of weather and war. He called it Promise, though Reva had never asked why. When he died, shot in the back by a man he'd once called brother, Reva took the gun off his body and swore she'd find the bastard herself. But the trail had gone cold, and the fire in her chest that used to feel like justice had begun to turn into smoke, ash choking her lungs more than it warmed her blood. She hadn't used Promise once in the 2 years since her father's death, and now the weight of it in the holster felt more like guilt than power. That's when he came limping up the path. The Apache. He had no horse. One leg dragged behind him like a wounded dog, wrapped in torn leather and bloody cloth. His coat was threadbare, more dust than wool. His face was lined with sun and time, and his left eye had a fog over it like dead water. But he walked like he meant to be there, and that was enough to make Reva lower her mug. He stopped at the edge of the porch and looked at her with that one sharp eye and said, "Is it his?" Reva looked down at the Colt. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The Apache nodded once, slow. "It should speak again." Reva frowned. "You know who killed him?" The man's lips twitched, like a smile that remembered too many dead. "I know the kind of man who would." Reva stood. Her boots hit the planks like drums. "If you came for the gun, you better have more than guesses." The Apache looked past her toward the distant hills. "I have a debt. Your father paid it." Reva's jaw tightened. She remembered stories her father told late at night when he'd had too much whiskey and guilt, about a winter when he served with the Scouts in New Mexico territory. A burned village, a child pulled from the ashes. Reva hadn't known whether to believe it. Now she was looking at a man who had that same fire in his eyes, buried behind years of surviving. "What's your name?" she asked. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Not unless I come back." Reva stared at him. The wind caught the edge of her duster. Her hand hovered over the Colt. Then she unbuckled the holster, drew the revolver, and held it out, grip first. "Then take it," she said. "And if you don't come back, I'll find you." The Apache took the weapon with reverence. Not greed, not triumph. Reverence. He turned and walked back the way he'd come, one step at a time, each footfall a promise. Reva didn't see him again for 30 days. The days passed like worn prayer beads through calloused fingers. She tended the ranch, patched fences, rode into town once a week for supplies. People asked about the gun. She lied, said she'd sold it, said it was time to move on. But every night she sat on that porch, staring at the hills, wondering what kind of man would walk off with another's vengeance, wondering if she'd made a mistake, if the Apache had just taken the last piece of her father and vanished into myth. Then, on the 30th morning, she saw the dust trail. 2 figures, one riding, one walking. She stepped off the porch and squinted into the sun. The Apache rode up on a bay Mustang, lean and hard-eyed. Across the saddle horn, tied with rope and caked in blood, was a man with a bullet through his thigh and a gag in his mouth. His eyes were wide with hate and recognition. Reva felt her breath stop. The Apache dismounted, pulled the limp man to the dirt and said, "He ran. Took 6 days to find him, 3 to break his gang, 1 to shoot him proper." Reva looked at the man on the ground. His hair was gray at the temples, his teeth yellow. But the eyes were the same, cold, reptilian. The man her father had once called brother. The man who'd killed him for the contents of a saddlebag and the promise of gold that never came. She stepped forward, looked him in the eye. "You remember me?" she asked. He nodded once, mouth full of cloth. "Then you know why I'm not untying you." She turned to the Apache. He handed her the Colt. It was cleaned, loaded. She stared at it for a long moment, then at the crippled man who had returned it. "What's your name?" she asked again. This time he answered, "Taza." She nodded. "You brought him back. Why?" Taza looked at her with that fogged eye, and something in his voice went hollow. "Because I owed your father, but also because I remember the day he carried me from fire, and because the man who lit that fire is now at your feet." Reva's hand curled around the grip of the revolver. It felt right, warm, alive. The man on the ground squirmed. Taza didn't flinch. "You want him dead?" she asked. "He's yours," Taza said. "I already killed the others." And so the reckoning began, and Reva stood over the man like a mountain made of grief and dust and grit. The Colt in her hand, heavier than any burden she'd ever carried, heavier even than her father's absence. The man on the ground writhed like a trapped snake, his eyes bulging, spitting curses through the gag, but none of them reached her, not really. His voice was just noise now. She could still see the last moment she saw her father alive, boots in the stirrups, coat flapping, as he rode out to meet a man he thought was still his brother. She remembered the look in his eyes before he turned his back, a look she hadn't recognized at the time, but which now made perfect sense. He knew. On some level, he knew he wasn't coming back. He just didn't want to believe it. And she'd sat in that house for 2 years, replaying that moment over and over again, wishing she'd stopped him, begged him, followed him. And now here this man was, the one who shot her father and left him face down in the scrub, the one who took everything from her family for the promise of a gold cache that didn't exist. She looked at the Colt, ran her thumb over the ivory grip. It felt like her father's voice, like the smell of his pipe, like the creak of his saddle and the sound of his hand knocking dust off his hat. It wasn't just a gun, it was everything he was. And now she had it again, held it steady, and pointed it between the eyes of the man who murdered him. But something in her heart didn't burn the way she expected it to. There was anger, yes, there was pain, but not rage, not the kind that blinds you, makes your hand shake. She was calm, too calm. The desert stood still around her. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Taza watched from a few paces back, silent, unreadable. He didn't interfere. He had done what he said he would do. He had brought the killer. The rest was up to her. She crouched low, met the man's eyes. "You shot him in the back," she said. "You looked him in the eye before that, shared a drink with him, maybe even hugged him. And then you waited for him to turn, and you pulled the trigger. Because of some half-baked rumor about hidden gold in a canyon that never paid a soul a single dollar. He trusted you." The man mumbled through the gag. She pulled it down. "Go on," she said. "Say it." He coughed, spat blood, then rasped. "He was a fool. Your old man was a dreamer. Always thought men could change. That's why he died." Reva stood, her boots crunching against dry gravel. "No, he died because you couldn't." She raised the Colt. The man's face twisted, not in fear, but contempt. "You think killing me will bring him back?" She shook her head. "No, but it'll let him rest." She cocked the hammer. The sound was final, like a judge's gavel, like the closing of a coffin. But then, just as her finger tightened, she stopped. She looked at Taza. "How many of the others did you kill?" "3, he said. "1 shot himself when I cornered him. 2 fought. They died quick." "And this one?" He ran, hid, paid off 2 men to cover his tracks. He was the last. Reva nodded. She holstered the Colt. Then let him live. The man looked up, startled, eyes wide with confused hope. You're not gonna... You'll hang, she said. Publicly. I want the world to know what you did. I want you to rot in a cell for as many days as my father lies in the ground, and I want people to spit when they hear your name. She turned to Taza. We ride at first light. You help me get him to the sheriff. After that, I never see you again. Taza nodded once. Agreed. They camped that night in silence. Taza sat by the fire, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of something Reva didn't recognize. The prisoner lay bound, watched constantly. Reva cleaned the Colt, each swipe of the cloth slow and measured, like a ritual. What was his name? Taza asked. My father, she replied. Jonas Harper. He saved me once, Taza said. Gave me food. Took a bullet for me when the others wanted to finish what the flames started. Your mother hated it. Said he shouldn't bring trouble to the house, but he said, that boy's not trouble. He's a life that deserves another chance. Reva swallowed hard. He never told me that part. He wouldn't, Taza said. He was humble, but I owe him everything. My name, my life, my second breath. She stared into the flames. You paid that debt. No, Taza said. You did. You gave me his gun, you trusted me, and you didn't let the hate finish what the bullet started. They didn't speak again that night. The ride to the sheriff's took 3 days. By the time they arrived, the killer was barely conscious, but alive. The sheriff, a wiry man named Ellis, raised his brows when he saw who they brought. We've had posters on this one for years, he said. Thought he was long dead. No, Reva said. He's just been hiding, like a rat. But he's yours now. And the bounty? Forget it, she said. Just make sure the people know what he did. The sheriff nodded. Taza turned to leave then without ceremony. He mounted the Mustang, nodded once to Reva, and said, I'll see you in another life. She nodded back. And if I do, I'll remember. Then he rode away. Reva never saw him again, but the Colt stayed with her, cleaned, polished, restored, not for killing, for remembering, for honoring. She hung it above the fireplace of her father's cabin. Every year, on the day she gave it away, she would pour 2 cups of coffee, place one on the porch rail, and sit with the other in silence. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the wind came down from the hills with that low whistle, she thought she could hear the hoofbeats of a Mustang limping through the canyon, carrying the memory of a man who had once been saved by fire and who, in turn, had delivered justice without asking for anything in return. And she would whisper, Thank you, Taza. Then drink her coffee slow, Colt gleaming behind her, and know that her father finally rested easy. The trial was held 2 weeks later in Dry Mesa, and the courthouse hadn't seen that many boots on its floorboards since the flood of '73. Word had spread faster than wildfire in July. Jonas Harper's killer was in custody, and not just custody, but carried in like a sack of rotted meat by none other than his daughter, and a silent Apache no one dared question. Folks from 3 counties showed up, some out of curiosity, some for spectacle, but a few because they remembered Jonas, not as a gun hand or a man of violence, but as the rancher who'd offered tools to young men starting out grain, to the widow who'd lost her mule, and a hand on the shoulder to anyone who needed it. He wasn't a saint, but he'd stood when others stayed seated, and that counted for something. Reva sat in the front row. She didn't testify. She didn't need to. The sheriff gave his account, dry and flat as paper, and the accused, once known as Edgar Thorne, former Union scout turned highway ghost, never opened his mouth once after being arrested. Whether it was pride or shame or fear, no one knew. When the judge read the sentence, guilty to hang by the neck until dead, Reva didn't flinch. She didn't cheer. She just nodded once and walked out into the pale morning light, like someone who'd been holding their breath for a decade and could finally exhale. She stayed in town that night, didn't sleep, just sat in the room above the saloon with the Colt resting across her lap, the lamplight flickering on its nickel barrel like firelight dancing on water. It looked different now, not because it was cleaner, but because it had seen something sacred. It had passed through violence and vengeance and returned as something else, not just a weapon, a witness. She had thought in the beginning that vengeance would be the only answer that made sense. But now, with Thorne behind bars and his sentence set, she felt something unexpected, weightless. Not peace, not yet, but something like it. Closure, maybe, or the possibility of it. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, she saddled her horse, packed light, and rode out east. Not forever, not to disappear, but to walk away from the graves she'd been circling. The ranch would wait, the fences would hold, but she needed to see the places her father once talked about. The canyon where he'd first found gold dust in the water, the ridge where he'd spotted a hawk and followed it for 2 miles, thinking it was leading him somewhere divine. She followed those stories now, one by one, like breadcrumbs through the mountains. The Colt stayed holstered. She didn't draw it once. But each time she made camp, she'd clean it by firelight, hand steady, almost reverent. It wasn't for killing anymore. It was a reminder of trust, of debts repaid, of choices that don't unmake the past, but build something stronger in its place. A month into her journey, she reached Silver Hollow, a ghost town perched between cliff walls, like a secret never meant to be found. Jonas had spoken of it like a dream, said it was the only place he ever thought about settling before life. War and duty pulled him in too many directions. She rode into it slow, her horse snorting at the scent of dust and history. Most of the buildings were skeletal now, but one stood nearly whole. The old chapel. Its door creaked open with a push, and inside, amid sunbeams breaking through warped boards, Reva found something she never expected. A carving, on the altar wood, faded but visible. A hawk, wings spread wide. Beneath it a name, Jonas H., and a date, 1859. She traced it with her fingers, heart pounding like hooves. He'd been here, sat here, maybe prayed here, maybe decided in that moment that the world wasn't ready for peace yet, but he'd find ways to plant it anyway. She pulled the Colt from her side and placed it on the altar just for a second, just to see what it looked like, bathed in golden light. It shimmered, not ominous, not heavy, just complete. Then she holstered it and sat on the front pew. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, she just breathed. Long, deep, free. That night she slept under open sky. And for the first time in years, her dreams didn't end in gunfire. She dreamt of her father smiling, nodding, and walking off into tall grass that reached up toward the sun, shoulders loose, weight gone. And beside him, just behind, a younger Apache boy, limping but not broken, hand resting on a carved wooden hawk. Back home, a few weeks later, she returned to her porch. She cleaned the steps, mended the rail, hung the Colt above the fireplace for the last time. It never needed to fire again, not because the world had grown kind, but because one day, long ago, she gave it to someone who deserved it, and he brought it back carrying not just vengeance, but truth. And truth, unlike bullets, never misses. Reva stayed on the porch until the sun bled out behind the ridge and the shadows came crawling like snakes across the dirt. She didn't light a lamp, didn't speak, didn't move except to sip from the whiskey bottle in her lap, the same bottle her father had hidden behind the flour tins when company came. The revolver, freshly returned, lay across her knees. The ivory grip was smooth again, worn by someone else's hand now. Taza had polished it, maintained it, used it. She could see it in the new wear marks on the cylinder, the slight blackened residue along the barrel that hadn't been there before. But it hadn't been misused. It had been carried like a relic, like something holy, and now it was home again. The killer sat in a holding cell in Dry Mesa. The law would deal with him, if law could be trusted to carry out what justice demanded. And yet Reva still felt unfinished. Not empty, not satisfied, just waiting. Like something was still coming. Maybe it was the silence after so many years of noise in her head. Maybe it was the absence of hate, which left a hole wider than she expected. She closed her eyes and thought back to the day her father left and didn't come back. She hadn't been surprised, not really. He was a man made of half-finished stories and promises he rarely broke, but sometimes forgot. He had scars she'd only ever seen when he shaved, and a 1,000-yard stare that came and went, depending on the wind. He was kind, but never soft, gentle, but always ready. She knew he'd made enemies. What she didn't know was how easily one of them could smile and drink with him in the morning and put a bullet in his back by dusk. That night, sleep came in short, sharp bursts. She dreamed of fire, of boot prints in dry blood, of her own hand shaking as she held the Colt for the first time, fresh from her father's corpse. In the dream the revolver whispered, not in words, in memories. Each bullet in the chamber was a name, a moment, a price. She woke before dawn with sweat cold on her back and the taste of dust in her throat. The ranch didn't need her yet, so she saddled up and rode out toward Ghost Ridge, where her father used to take her to think. The ride took half a day, up through narrow switchbacks and dry gullies where only mountain goats dared make a home. When she reached the top, she sat on the same flat stone he used to sit on, legs crossed, the Colt resting in her lap like it belonged there. She watched hawks circle overhead. She thought of Taza and the limp in his gait, thought of the men he'd killed to find the one that mattered. She thought of how he had taken the revolver not as a tool, but as a trust. He could have run, could have vanished into the desert, left her with nothing but regret and a story no one would believe. But he didn't. He came back. And not just with a body, with a truth. The kind of truth people bled for. She stayed up there until stars blinked open in the bruised sky, cooked beans over a low fire, let her horse graze freely. Then she unfolded a piece of old hide from her saddlebag, a map her father once drew by hand, of all the places he'd seen, all the trails he'd ridden. Some were marked in ink, some scratched in blood. At the corner, near the top, was a single letter, T. She traced it with her fingertip. "Taza," she whispered. Her father had marked the boy's name, had carried his memory with him even after all those years. It wasn't just a war rescue. It was a bond, a pact, and now she was the one carrying it. The next morning, she rode back to town, not to visit the killer, not to gloat, but to ask a question. The jailhouse was quiet. Sheriff Ellis sat on the porch, chewing tobacco and watching the sun move like a lazy bullet across the sky. He nodded at her as she dismounted. "He's still breathing," he said. "Ain't said a word. But he eats, sleeps. Don't ask for nothing." Reva nodded. "Can I see him?" Ellis hesitated, then stood and opened the door. Inside, the cell was dim. The man, Edgar Thorne, sat against the back wall, legs stretched out, face hollowed by days of silence. When he looked up at her, his eyes didn't carry malice. They carried something worse, recognition, like he'd already made peace with the noose and didn't care what came before it. "You look like your old man," he rasped. "More backbone, maybe." She didn't rise to it. "Why'd you do it?" she asked. He shrugged. "Greed, jealousy, the usual. He had something I didn't." "What?" "Peace," he said. Even after all the war, all the blood, he could look a man in the eye and not flinch. That kind of peace pisses a man off, if he ain't got it. Reva stared. "So you killed him because he was better than you?" "Because I couldn't stand the way he looked at me," Thorne muttered, "like I could still be saved." She didn't speak, just turned and left. Outside, the wind had picked up. The world felt sharper somehow, more honest. She looked down at her boots, the dust clinging to the seams, the same dust her father had walked through, the same dust Taza had limped across to bring her the man who'd broken her family. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the start of something older, something harder. Justice wasn't a bullet. It was a choice, and she had made hers. She rode home, hung the Colt back over the fireplace, poured herself a glass of whiskey, and sat beneath its shadow. Her father's chair creaked as she leaned back. The floorboards groaned with familiarity. The sky beyond the window burned with stars. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to keep watch. The weight of vengeance was gone. The killer was in chains. The Apache had paid his debt and vanished back into the stories from which he came. And somewhere, maybe 1,000 miles from here, Taza sat beside his own fire, staring at the night, remembering a girl who gave him a gun and a promise that kept its word. The following weeks passed like smoke, visible for a moment, then gone, leaving only the scent behind. Reva kept to the ranch, fixing what needed fixing, checking fences, clearing brush, oiling tools, and watching the weather as if it might tell her what to do next. Every so often, a rider would pass through asking about Edgar Thorne, some of them with blood in their eyes, others hoping to trade gossip for liquor. Reva told them nothing. Thorne's story wasn't hers to sell. She gave them cold water and a quiet warning. Don't look too long at the past, unless you want it staring back. That usually shut them up. One morning, the sheriff rode up the hill, dust in his beard, sweat on his collar. He tipped his hat and sat stiffly on her porch rail. "He's dead," he said, and didn't need to say more. Reva nodded, waited, listened. "Rope did its job," he went on. "Didn't fight it. Priest said he went quiet. No last words. Just nodded and stepped off." Reva didn't speak for a long time. Then she asked, "You bury him?" "Town did. Pine box. Unmarked." "Good," she said. "Let the wind have his name." She expected something to change after that, some switch to flip, some weight to lift. But the truth was quieter than that. It didn't roar, it didn't sing, it just settled, like dust after a long ride. One night, unable to sleep, Reva got up and pulled down the Colt from above the hearth. It was cold to the touch, smooth as ever. She carried it outside and sat by the old fence where her father used to string rope and tell stories. She held the gun in her lap, looked out over the starlit range, and whispered, "It's done." And it was. Not just the revenge, the grief, the waiting. The part of her that needed to hold on had finally let go. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. There was peace in her bones now, forged in the dust and sealed by fire. She thought of Taza, wondered where he was, if he had found rest, if he still carried her father's voice in his step. A month later, a parcel arrived by courier. No name, no note, just a small, wrapped bundle and a scrap of leather tied with twine. Reva opened it slowly. Inside was a carved figurine, a hawk, wings stretched in flight. Simple, elegant, familiar. Beneath it was a thin strip of cloth dyed the color of ash and earth, and on it was stitched a single word, Stillness. Reva held the hawk in both hands, breath catching just for a moment. Taza had sent it. She knew it like she knew her own name. It wasn't a thank you. It wasn't farewell. It was understanding, an echo of something ancient, a bond between two people whose lives had twisted together in the heat of justice and cooled in the shade of something truer than blood. She placed the hawk on her mantle next to the Colt, and for the first time it looked right. The gun and the bird, war and peace, two halves of a story that had finally been told. As the seasons shifted, Reva began writing again. Not letters, not journals, stories, true ones mostly, tales of the border towns, of men who ran and women who hunted, of debts repaid in silence and guns that told the truth better than any preacher. She never published them, didn't care to, but the act of writing was its own kind of healing. On certain nights, when the wind moved just right and the moon rode low across the sky, she'd light a lamp, pour 2 glasses of whiskey, one for her, one for memory, and speak her father's name aloud, just once. Then she'd raise the glass and say, "You did good, old man, and you kept your word." And in the quiet that followed, she swore she could hear boots on dry earth and a horse snorting somewhere beyond the fence line, waiting for her to saddle up and ride. The hills never gave back the sound of Taza's departure. He had vanished into legend, the way certain men do, not with noise, but with certainty. And that was enough. His chapter was closed, but never erased. Reva didn't need to find him. Some stories are better when they walk away under their own power. She focused on what lay ahead: the ranch, the land, the life her father had built not from bullets but from sweat. The Colt stayed on the mantel, and over time people stopped asking if she ever used it again. They didn't need to. The ones who needed to know already did, and the ones who didn't, they stayed polite. Years later, a child asked her what the gun was for. She smiled, leaned down, and said, "It was my father's." And for a while it was a promise. The child asked if it ever killed anyone. Reva said, "Enough." Then she took down the hawk carving, placed it in the child's hands, and said, "This one matters more because it sees everything from high up. It remembers where we've been, but it doesn't carry hate in its wings, just stillness." And when the wind blew through the grass and over the bones of old trails, it didn't sound like ghosts anymore. It sounded like peace. When spring returned to the high desert, the wild sage bloomed along the edges of the dry creek beds, and Reva Harper woke each morning with the same thought etched deep into her spine like old weathered script: "He's gone, and I'm still here." The Colt revolver hung over the hearth like a memory fossilized in steel and ivory, its weight a constant, even when the world kept changing around her. The man who killed her father was gone, buried in a pine box with no name carved into the cross, the wind the only mourner left to mark his passing. But revenge, once it was spent, didn't heal the wound. It just cauterized it. Her days were quiet now, filled with chores that spoke little and asked nothing of her soul, tending the goats, repairing the fence posts that buckled in the thaw, oiling the tack and saddles that hadn't seen use since last fall. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right and the sun hadn't yet burned the morning into color, she'd hear the ghost of her father's voice in the barn, humming that half-tuned ballad he used to sing while brushing the horse. Always one key flat, but steady as a metronome. It didn't haunt her. It didn't hurt. It just lived there now, part of the place, part of her. There were still people who came asking questions, sometimes looking for trouble, sometimes looking for stories, drifters, journalists, deputy marshals with too many opinions and too little sense. Reva never gave them more than a few words. The ones who asked about Taza, she sent packing. She never spoke his name aloud anymore, not out of shame, but out of respect. Some names belonged to the wind, and Taza's had become one of them. The letters started in June, written in tight, angular script. Cool. No return address, just a single name signed at the bottom: Noah. The first one was short, no more than a paragraph, written on rough cotton paper that smelled faintly of smoke and desert myrrh. It said, "He reached us, the man with the limp. He told your story, and his. The fire still burns in the east, but we've seen what it can do when carried by someone who remembers who they are. We owe him, and you. Thank you." Reva read the letter 3 times before folding it and tucking it into the drawer beside her bed. 2 weeks later, another came. "There are things buried deeper than bones. You touched one and walked away. Most people don't. We keep the fire for people like you." That letter she didn't read again. It stayed sealed, pressed between pages of her father's ledger, a record of cattle bought and sold from years back. She didn't know who Noah was, or what kind of fire they referred to, but the words didn't scare her. They felt like a passing torch, a recognition of something she didn't need to define to understand. The third letter never came. She figured that meant the story had moved on, as stories do. By late July, a drought set in. The creek dried to a memory, and the animals grew thin, restless. Reva took to riding farther out, checking the property lines, mapping the dry spots, watching the sky for signs that never came. The land cracked. The trees sighed under the weight of nothing. One day she found a strange marking carved into the base of an old cottonwood stump, 3 notches in a circle, arranged like a broken wheel. She touched it lightly, tracing the shape with her finger, the bark rough and warm from the sun. It didn't belong there. She'd passed that stump 100 times, and it had never been marked. Something told her it wasn't a warning. It was a signature. Maybe his, maybe theirs. She didn't know. She didn't need to. She turned her horse north and rode to where the hills broke open like an old scar, to the ridge where she and her father had once watched a thunderstorm roll in from 3 counties away, lightning like gods carving roads across the heavens. She dismounted, walked to the edge, and sat on the flat stone where Jonas Harper used to smoke his last pipe before dark. The wind there carried no scent, no promise, just the clean, hard truth of survival. Reva sat in silence until the stars came, and when she stood, she whispered into the dark, "I'm ready." The journey east wasn't planned. It unfolded. One day she woke and knew the ranch didn't need her anymore. The animals had been sold. The house was quiet. The Colt was packed in a leather case and wrapped in a wool blanket. She left a letter pinned to the door for the next hands who might live there, and she rode out on the same mare her father once broke with only rope and instinct. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She just rode. Through old mining towns with boarded windows, through cotton valleys where people stared like they recognized her but didn't know why, through pine passes that smelled of rain and silence. In one town, she met a man named Felix, who told her stories of a woman who rode south with a hawk carved from mesquite in her saddlebag and a revolver made of silver that never missed. Reva smiled and said nothing. In another town, a child handed her a feather wrapped in red thread and said, "You look like someone who carries names." She tucked the feather into her coat, rode on. By the time she reached the edge of Texas, the Colt had not fired a shot, but she had drawn it twice. Once to scare off a pack of coyotes circling an old woman's goat pen, and once to remind a man in a saloon that a woman's silence was not an invitation. It felt different now when she held it, not angry, not heavy, just real, part of her. When she reached the river, she camped under a cottonwood and listened to the sound of water moving through stone. It reminded her of her father's stories, the ones that began with, "Back when the river ran full," and men had something to prove. She slept beneath the stars and dreamed of Taza again. This time he stood by a fire, carving something into a branch, his face older, wiser, his limp nearly gone. He looked at her and said, "You're not done yet." When she woke, the fire was out, but the message lingered. She crossed the river the next morning and didn't look back. She passed through towns so small they didn't even carry names, just mile markers and ghosts, places where the roads were older than the people and the wind carried stories instead of directions. Somewhere past the basin, where the bones of a sunken stagecoach rested like a broken jaw, she stopped at a trading post run by a Navajo woman who didn't ask questions, only offered her coffee and fry bread and a seat in the shade. The woman looked at Reva's saddlebag, the shape of the Colt wrapped in cloth, and said, "That gun's seen more truth than most men." Reva didn't answer. She just nodded, her fingers tightening around the tin mug. The woman gave her a map, hand-drawn, ink on hide, showing trails the army never charted, and rivers that dried up before any white man knew to look for them. At the edge of the map was a symbol carved deep into the hide, a hawk's eye, above a set of mountains, the same hawk Reva had seen carved into her father's old chapel. "Follow the eye," the woman said, "if you want to find the man who left it behind." Reva didn't ask how the woman knew. Some things in the desert weren't learned. They were remembered. She rode for 3 more days before she found him. Taza was waiting in the ruins of an old mission, a stone skeleton rising out of the red dirt like a grave marker too proud to fall. He sat beneath the arch, carving wood as always, but this time it was not a hawk, it was a hand, fingers open, palm facing upward. He looked older now, or maybe just clearer, like something in him had finished settling. He didn't stand when she approached. He just said, "I knew you'd come." Reva dismounted, tied her mare to a crooked post, and walked over without a word. She sat across from him, the Colt heavy in her saddlebag. Taza passed her a strip of jerky, and they chewed in silence. Finally she said, "You sent the hawk." "I sent truth," he answered. "It came in many shapes." "What is this place?" she asked. "A place where things end," he said, "or begin, depending who you ask." "Why did you want me here?" "Because the fire isn't out yet." He reached into a pouch and pulled out a worn leather journal tied with sinew. He handed it to her. "Your father's," he said. "He gave it to me the day he died, told me not to read it, said it was for you." Reva stared at it like it might vanish. She took it slowly, hands trembling, and opened to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable, bold, looping letters stained with weather and time. "To my daughter, if this finds you, I'm gone. Not just from the land, but from the war. The one inside me." She read it aloud, each word a match struck against her ribs. The journal was filled with stories, confessions, regrets, hopes, names she'd never heard, things her father had done while wearing a badge, a uniform, or just a face the world needed. Taza let her read through the day and into the night. When she finished, the stars were out, and the fire was down to coals. "I never knew half of this," she whispered. "You weren't supposed to," Taza said, "but now that you do, you can decide what it means." "What do I do with it?" "You carry it, not like weight, like fire. You light other stories with it." Reva closed the book and looked at him. "And you?" He looked toward the mountains. "I've done what I came to do, paid the debt, buried the names, but I'll keep walking, until the land forgets me or remembers enough to let me stop." She wanted to say more, ask him to come with her, stay, but she didn't, because she understood. Some spirits couldn't rest in one place, not even the living kind. They parted at dawn. She rode east again, past towns burned down by memory, past rivers that ran backwards during storm season, past all the old roads that once led her father to violence and now led her to something better. She settled in a place called Mercy's Bend, nothing more than 3 houses, a church, and a well. There, she opened a small post offering shelter, repairs, and honest work to those passing through. No signs, no questions, just a clean cot and warm bread. She never wore the Colt on her hip again, but it stayed behind the counter in reach. Not out of fear, but because truth, once drawn, doesn't go back in the scabbard. She kept her father's journal beneath her bed. She read a page each morning, and some nights she added to it new stories, new names, pieces of her own fire. She never saw Taza again, but sometimes she'd find carvings near her door, a hawk, a hand, an open eye, and she would nod to the wind, pour an extra cup of coffee, and place it by the fire, because some debts are repaid not in silver or in blood, but in stillness, and she had earned hers. The years rolled in slow and dry like the wind off the mesa, brushing the town of Mercy's Bend until it felt worn smooth by time, like river stones left too long in moving water. Reva Harper became known simply as the woman with the scar on her collarbone and the revolver. She never drew. Most folks didn't know her story. They only knew she came from somewhere west of the mountains, carried silence like it was armor, and had eyes that looked through a man rather than at him. They called her ma'am, not out of politeness, but respect. The kind that has nothing to do with age or blood, but everything to do with what a person's hands have done and refused to do. She patched shoes. She pulled calves from breached births. She boiled coffee like it was religion and baked bread that somehow made even liars sit straighter at the table. But what she did best, what she never admitted to, was listening. Travelers came through with all kinds of burdens, some seeking water, some chasing revenge, some running from it. And Reva let them speak if they needed to, or sit in silence if that was kinder. Sometimes she offered advice, and sometimes she just handed them a scrap of fry bread and looked them in the eye until they remembered who they were. She wrote in the journal every week. Her father's handwriting stopped halfway through the pages, but hers filled the rest, a careful thread of memory stitched over old scars. She never titled the entries, never dated them, just stories, truths, lessons not yet learned. She left space at the end of each page for someone else, someone she hadn't met yet, someone who would one day carry the fire forward. One spring, when the river ran high and the clouds hung low like sheep caught in the barbed wire of the sky, a girl appeared at Reva's gate. No more than 14, boots too big, hair like fire, and a look in her eye that said she hadn't known safety in a long while. She didn't speak for the first 2 days, just drank the water, ate the food, and slept under the lean-to like a stray dog not sure whether the hand that fed her would swing next. Reva didn't press. She knew that kind of silence. She knew how it could hollow a person out. On the 3rd morning, the girl spoke. "Your name, Reva Harper?" Reva looked up from chopping wood. "Used to be. They say you killed a man with a single shot through the heart, tied him up yourself and walked him 3 counties before the rope did the rest." "They say a lot of things," Reva replied. The girl nodded. "They also say you knew a ghost who walked with a limp and carried no name." Reva put down the axe. "You looking for a story?" "No," the girl said. "I think I'm in one." Reva made coffee, poured 2 mugs, set them on the porch rail. They drank in silence. Later that night, the girl asked for a place to stay a while. Reva nodded once. That was all. The next morning, the girl helped gather eggs, and by sundown, she was asking how to mend saddle leather. By the end of the week, she asked about the Colt. Reva showed it to her. Let her hold it. The girl was careful, respectful. "You ever shoot it any more?" "Haven't had to," Reva said. "It still work?" "Well enough." The girl paused. "You afraid of forgetting how?" "No," Reva said. "I'm afraid of remembering too easily." The girl stayed for the better part of a year. Her name was Elsie, though she didn't use it much at first. It took a long time for her to tell Reva why she'd come. A man had taken something from her, not her life, something worse, her voice, her story. He'd left her alive so he could keep lying about what he'd done. Reva didn't say much after Elsie told her. She just handed her the journal. "Write it down," she said, "and start with the truth. Then we'll figure out the rest." Elsie did, her handwriting shaky at first, then strong. The fire came back to her in ink before it returned to her eyes. When she finally smiled again, it was crooked but fierce, like something born in a storm and raised in the ash. In the fall of that year, a rider came through Mercy's Bend. He wore a sheriff's badge from a town far east, and rode like he'd been sent by something colder than the law. He asked questions, described a girl, carried a photo. Reva served him coffee, let him speak. Then she said, "You can ride back the way you came, or you can try and take what don't belong to you. But I'll warn you now, this place remembers what most forget, and I still remember how to aim." The man left before the coffee cooled, never came back. Years passed. Elsie grew taller, stronger. She learned how to ride without fear, how to mend broken things without cursing, how to look a man in the eye and speak the truth without trembling. She called Reva ma'am until one day, without thinking, she called her mama. Reva didn't flinch, just nodded and said, "You're home now." One winter, a letter came from far north. No return, just 3 words inside: still walking, still fire. It wasn't signed, but Reva didn't need it to be. She folded it gently, tucked it into the back of the journal, and stared at the sky for a long time, wondering where Taza walked now, what songs he heard in the wind, what trails he'd burned into the land. She never went looking for him again. She didn't have to. They'd already found each other once. That was enough. When Reva Harper passed, it wasn't with a bang. It was in the quiet of early morning, the fire low, the coffee warm, the Colt resting in a locked chest beneath the floorboards. Elsie found her there, sitting upright in the chair on the porch, hands folded in her lap, eyes closed like she was just thinking too long about something worth remembering. She buried her behind the chapel ruins out by the ridge, beneath the hawk carving, wrapped the Colt in leather, and tucked it back into the chest with a note. "For the next who needs it, speak truth before fire." Then she took the journal, saddled her mare, and rode south. Because some fires don't end, they're passed forward. And some stories don't close, they become legend. The road stretched ahead like a sunburnt scar across the earth, and Elsie rode it with the kind of quiet that carried purpose. She didn't wear a badge, didn't chase bounties. She didn't even wear the Colt most days, though it rested inside her saddlebags, wrapped in the same cloth Reva had used, the ivory grip peeking out like a ghost still willing to speak if asked. The journal, now twice as thick as when her hands first touched it, had begun to fill with stories of her own, places she stopped, people she helped, names she remembered, names she buried. Every entry ended the same way, not with the end, but with a single word Reva had once whispered by the fire: stillness. It wasn't surrender, it wasn't silence. It was peace made with the fire inside, the kind that burned without consuming, the kind passed from one woman's hand to another until the world didn't need to ask any more who they were, only what they carried. One day she came upon a man on the side of the road, gut-shot and bleeding from a wound he tried to hide beneath his coat. He was dying, and they both knew it. She gave him water. He told her his name, Jude, and said he once rode with Edgar Thorne back before the killing, back before everything soured. He said Reva spared him, Jude coughed, his blood thick in the dust. Said she gave him more than he ever gave anyone. Elsie nodded and held his hand as he passed. Later that night, she wrote his name in the journal and placed a rock over the grave, marking it with the symbol Taza had carved years ago, a hawk above an open hand. She rode into storm country next, where the sky turned black at noon and the rain came down like nails. In a town built around a burned-out mining shaft, she met a woman who spoke no English but wept when she saw the journal, flipping through it with trembling fingers until she stopped at a name written in the margins, a name she said belonged to her brother, gone for 10 winters. He'd helped Taza once, she said, and was never seen again. Elsie stayed 3 nights, helped fix the barn roof, mended a broken wheel, then moved on before the sun dried the mud. She never stayed long. That wasn't her purpose. Reva hadn't stayed. Taza hadn't stayed. The fire moved forward. She grew older, wiser. The Colt remained mostly untouched, save for the few times she drew it to protect someone who didn't have a voice loud enough to stop a fist or a lie. It never missed, but she never fired to kill, not once. It had done enough killing before her. Now it only spoke when it had to, most times just showing it was enough. People had long memories out here, even if they didn't know what they remembered. They looked at her and saw echoes, Reva's jaw, Taza's silence, the calm before the storm that meant someone had already made peace with what needed doing. And so they stepped aside. They let her pass. In her 5th year on the road, she met a boy, just 12, scrawny, hungry, with a knife he didn't know how to use, and a lie in his mouth about being a bounty hunter's son. She didn't press him, gave him bread, sat beside him as he watched the sun go down like it was trying to hide behind the hills. "They killed my ma," he said. "Said she stole from the wrong man, but she only took what was ours." Elsie nodded. What was her name? "Lena," he said. "Lena Voss." She opened the journal and wrote the name down. "You remember her?" she said. "That's what matters." "You going to kill the man who did it?" the boy asked. "No," she said, "but I'll help you remember why you don't have to." He followed her for a year, learned to read from the journal, learned to ride without spooking the horse, learned to fire a rifle only when nothing else would work. When she left him behind at a homestead where the couple had no children but eyes full of kindness, she gave him a copy of the journal pages he'd helped her write. "Tell it when it's time," she said. "Not before." He cried when she rode off, but he didn't follow. She kept riding. The day she returned to Mercy's Bend, the town looked different, smaller somehow, but the chapel still stood, and the well still gave water sweeter than anywhere she'd tasted. She slept under the porch where Reva once sat watch with her coffee and her revolver, and in the morning she walked to the edge of the ridge and looked out over the hills, where stories once burned so bright they carved shadows into the sky. She opened the journal, turned to the final page, and for the first time in her life she wrote a title, "The Fire We Carried." Then she closed the book, holstered the Colt for the last time, and walked down the ridge into whatever world waited for someone who had finally earned their stillness. Elsie stayed in Mercy's Bend longer than she planned. Something about the place, its quiet, its dust, the way the wind passed through without asking for anything, made her feel like she was living inside the very pages she'd spent years writing. She kept the journal close, wrapped in deerskin, tucked beneath the floorboard near her cot in the old chapel. She took to restoring the place, not out of piety, but preservation. Each stone she laid back into place felt like closing the mouth of some ghost still muttering beneath the dirt. Every board she nailed down over a broken window felt like a truth made solid. She never called it home, not out loud, but her hands learned every inch of it. The well behind the chapel gave clean water. The garden, once wild and overrun, now grew small shoots of corn and beans. There was peace here, not because the world had forgotten her, but because she had stopped letting it chase her. Still, riders came from time to time. Wanderers, broken men, sharpened women. The kinds of people who lived by instinct and died by code. Some came for shelter, some for something more. Some had heard of Reva Harper, a few had heard of Taza. Most didn't recognize the fire until they saw it in Elsie's eyes, and by then it was too late to pretend they had nothing to say. She let them speak, or didn't, gave them bread and space, and let the journal grow fat with the weight of their stories. She never judged, she never preached, but she always remembered. One man came with a knife still wet, hands shaking, eyes gone too far. She fed him, let him sleep, then told him about a boy once named Taza who had been pulled from flame by a man who could have looked away. Told him about a girl named Reva who chose to carry vengeance only as long as justice needed it, and no longer. The man wept like a child and left the knife behind on her doorstep. She buried it in the garden beneath a row of sage. In the winter of her 4th year in the chapel, the journal was nearly full again. Names stretched across pages like roots, some long dead, others still walking. She sat by the hearth one night, the Colt across her knees, cleaning it out of ritual more than need. The fire popped. The wind outside curled like a snake around the corners of the building. A knock came at the door, not urgent, not fearful, just present. She opened it and found a boy no older than 16, shoulders too broad for his age, wearing a coat that didn't fit, and a look in his eyes that said he'd crossed something he shouldn't have. "You're her," he said. "The one who carries the fire." Elsie nodded. "I carry a lot of things." "They killed my sister," he said. "She was 13. Took her like she was livestock. I tracked them." He held out a piece of paper, a crude map, drawn with charcoal, marked with X's and blood. "I can't finish it," he said, "but you can." Elsie didn't answer. She stepped aside, let him in, fed him, let him sleep. That night she packed. In the morning she took the Colt, the journal, and enough food for a week. The boy rode with her. The trail was not forgiving. The gang moved fast, burned their tracks, scattered when the wind turned against them, but they were messy, arrogant. They left signs they thought no one would read. Elsie read them all. It took 11 days to catch up. The boy wanted to shoot them in their sleep. She stopped him. "We do it clean," she said, "or we don't do it at all." They waited until dusk, slipped into the camp like smoke. There were 3 of them, older men, drunk, loud, unaware. The 4th sat by the fire, younger, scared, not part of the others' noise. Elsie took the Colt from her coat, walked into the firelight without a word. They didn't recognize her until it was too late. The first one reached for his rifle. She shot him through the shoulder. The second stood, shouted something obscene. She shot the ground between his feet. The third tried to run. The boy tackled him, pinned him. Elsie looked at the 4th, the quiet one. "Go," she said. "You've still got time to be something else." He ran. The others didn't. She tied them, dragged them behind their own fire, made them look at the boy. "Tell him her name," she said. The one with the broken nose spat blood. "Marley," he croaked. She said her name was Marley. The boy's breath hitched. He looked at Elsie. She nodded. "You choose," she said. "Not me." The boy stood there a long time. Then he walked away, didn't say a word. Elsie followed. They rode back in silence. Back at the chapel, the boy left a letter, said he was heading north, said he would remember the stillness, said he wouldn't forget the choice. Elsie watched him ride away, her shadow long behind her. Then she returned to the journal, opened a new page, and wrote down Marley's name. When the journal finally filled, she wrapped it in leather and buried it behind the chapel. Beneath the old hawk carving that had been redone so many times, it barely resembled anything at all. She started a new one, fresh paper, fresh fire. In the final winter of her life, she sat in the same chair Reva once favored, wrapped in the same wool shawl. The Colt now dull with age, but still sharp with purpose. She wrote slower now, less. But the stories still came. One day, a young woman arrived with a scar on her cheek and a pistol slung low on her hip. She said nothing at first, just sat by the fire, staring at the walls. When she finally spoke, she asked, "Did you know Taza?" Elsie smiled. "He knew me before I knew myself." The woman stayed 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, she was gone. But she left behind a coin etched with the symbol Elsie had only ever seen once before, a hawk, its wings wrapped around a flame. When Elsie passed, it was the same way Reva had, quiet, steady, watching the fire. The journal by her side. The Colt sealed in its box, wrapped in the cloth passed down through too many hands to name. A child found her, one of the new settlers who had come to Mercy's Bend to raise sheep and build windmills. The child didn't know her name, only that she had always been kind. The town buried her beneath the hawk. No headstone, just a word carved into the wood, Stillness. Years later, a young girl on a horse came riding through the hills, a journal in her saddlebag and a question in her heart. She didn't know the full story, just pieces. A woman named Reva, a man named Taza, a girl who carried their fire. She stopped at the chapel, drank from the well, sat by the grave, and when the wind passed over her shoulders, it whispered not in words, but in memory. She opened her own journal and began to write. The girl on horseback rode east with the wind pressing into her shoulders like invisible hands urging her forward. the kind of wind that carried old stories across plains and left their weight in the bones of anyone who dared listen too closely. She wasn't old enough to know fear the way Reva had, not yet, but she knew enough to ride with her eyes always scanning the horizon and her fingers brushing the edge of the journal tied behind her saddle. It had been passed to her in silence by a woman who never offered a name, only a nod, and the words, "You'll know when to use it." She had slept beside a dying fire that night, under stars she didn't recognize. And when she woke the next morning, the woman was gone, and the journal was hers. There was no map, only stories, but the stories held more direction than any trail could. They told her where not to ride, when to trust silence, and which men lied even when they smiled. And they whispered to her of Mercy's Bend, a place carved by time, not men, where the wind remembered too much and the soil didn't take kindly to cowards. She reached it 3 days later, the horse weary but strong, its hooves silent in the dry grass. The chapel stood just as the stories had said it would, leaning slightly east, bones of wood wrapped around stone, the hawk carved above the doorway, weathered but watching. She tied her horse near the well and stepped inside. It smelled like smoke and old paper. The hearth was cold, but the ashes were recent. Someone had left a tin cup upside down on the table and a single bullet standing upright beside it. She sat down, laid the journal on the table, and began to read aloud. Not because anyone could hear her, but because the room seemed to deserve it. The wind sighed through the slats in the roof. Dust danced. Outside, something shifted in the trees. She paused only once, to touch the revolver strapped to her thigh. A newer model, clean steel, but it had the weight of something older. She'd never fired it, not yet. The stories had warned her not to, unless she was ready to carry what came after. That night she stayed in the chapel, the journal open beside her bedroll. She had added 2 entries of her own, names, memories, and a promise. The next morning she dug a hole behind the chapel beneath the hawk carving and placed the journal inside a steel box. She covered it with dirt, pressed her palm to the ground, and whispered, "Stillness." It wasn't a prayer. It was a signal. Then she mounted her horse and rode west, toward the rising sun. Somewhere out there stories were unraveling again. She didn't know if she'd live to write the next journal or if someone else would pick it up where hers ended. But the trail stretched wide, and the fire inside her burned steady. She rode through valleys that held silence like a secret, through canyons that echoed the cries of people who'd disappeared without being forgotten. She passed through a town called Ash Hollow, where men looked at her with suspicion, but no one dared speak. The journal had told her about Ash Hollow, about a man who used to run whiskey and bodies through the church steps, about a woman who stopped him without drawing blood. She rode through and didn't stop. In another town, she heard rumors of a group of riders who called themselves the Marked. They branded a circle on their forearms and claimed they were born from fire. She met them outside a watering hole 3 days later. Their leader tried to take her gun. She let him grab it, let him feel its weight, then took it back without saying a word. He didn't follow her after that. The stories didn't say what the fire would look like in her hands, only that when it burned, the liars would know. Weeks passed, then months. She became a whisper herself, a girl who rode with old eyes and a steady hand, who carried stillness like a weapon. She returned to Mercy's Bend once, years later. The chapel still stood. The garden had overgrown, wild with vine and root, but beneath the hawk tree the earth remained firm, undisturbed. She didn't dig up the journal. She left a coin instead, carved with the same hawk and fire symbol she'd seen once etched into the side of a water flask, from a writer who never gave her his name but offered her half his bread. She sat by the well and carved a single word into the edge of the wood, "Begun." Then she mounted and rode north, where snow capped the tips of the red hills and the sky opened wider than any roof. She was older now, not old, but enough to understand that what Reva had done, what Taza had carried, what the journal held, it wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about memory. It was about choosing, again and again, not to become what tried to destroy you. She passed through lands where law didn't reach, where no flags flew, where the only truth came from those willing to protect it. In those places she was known not by her name, but by the way she carried the fire without letting it consume her. When she died, no one found her body, just a satchel beneath a broken windmill. Inside it, a revolver wrapped in cloth. A notebook with blank pages, the first one inscribed, "This story started with a gift. If you hold this now, you have a choice." And pinned beside it, a coin with a hawk, wings curled around flame, and a word scratched into its edge, "Stillness." South of the San Rafael Bluffs, where the land flattened into cracked skin and red sky, there was a mining town that never made it past its first winter. Locals called it Last Bell, though no bell was ever hung and no prayer was ever answered there. It was the kind of place that vanished from maps before it had a name, a cluster of leaning cabins, split-rail fences, and old shafts boarded over by men who either died underground or walked away without looking back. That's where she ended up. Not the girl, not Elsie, not the writers who came before, but someone new. Another fire-bearer. Another hand-me-down chapter in a story that had stopped pretending to end. He was 17. Not a man yet, not a child, but already made of scars and grit, and he arrived with nothing but a mule, a dented canteen, and a battered book with a hawk etched into the leather. No name on it, no inscription, but every page carried words that burned like scripture. The fire had come to him when a woman died in her sleep under the stars, holding his hand with a whisper he could barely hear. "It's yours now. Carry it different." He didn't know what she meant then, but he felt it in his chest every mile he rode after. He didn't speak for 3 days. Then he began writing, not for anyone else, just to remember the weight of things, her name, her silence, the way her eyes had looked not at him but through him, like she was seeing someone better that hadn't happened yet. Last Bell was empty when he arrived, but the air felt like it had just missed someone. The way a room feels warm after a fire's gone out. He built a lean-to against a collapsed storage shed, found a hand pump that still spat up rust-colored water if he coaxed it right, set out traps for rabbits, lit a fire with his last match, and waited, not for rescue, not for revenge, for something he couldn't name. The journal kept him steady. He read the old words slowly, traced the letters like tracks in the dust, names he didn't know, places he couldn't picture, but the feeling behind them, that slow, burning steadiness, that he understood. He cleaned his rifle twice a day, practiced drawing the revolver without firing. He had never killed a man, didn't want to, but he knew it was coming. That kind of knowing didn't come from fear. It came from wind, from silence, from the kind of inheritance that couldn't be refused. One morning, just after dawn, a rider came. Thin horse, long coat, rifle slung low, no badge, no greeting, just a nod and a question. "You the one carrying her story?" The boy stood, didn't flinch. "I'm carrying mine." The rider dismounted, tied the horse loose, sat on a rock near the fire. "They were right," he said. "She chose well." The boy didn't ask who, didn't need to. The rider pulled a folded paper from his coat, passed it over. A sketch, a map, no names, just an X drawn over a cluster of canyons where the ridges looked like broken teeth. "He's out there," the rider said. "Man who lit the fire that started all this. Never burned for it." The boy stared at the map, then at the rider. "You want me to kill him?" "Want's got nothing to do with it," the rider said. "But if you don't carry justice forward, it dies right here." The boy folded the map, tucked it into the journal, packed his gear, saddled the mule. The rider watched him with something like pride and something like grief. "You got her eyes," he said, "but you'll carry it different." The boy nodded once, then rode out toward the jagged horizon, journal pressed tight to his chest like a second heart. That night, wind swept across the flats. The last bell never rang, and the fire, quiet as breath, passed into one more set of hands.